As it turns out, whenever I end up stuck home alone for a number of days, I feel compelled to do something silly, and as a result of that, here I am, only a few months after I destroyed my throat talking about my collection of retro handhelds for the best part of over 2 hours, ready to talk about them some more. In particular, I want to talk about the developments that have happened since that last video, as my collection of machines has only continued to expand more and more over the past several weeks, and these developments have been all over the scale, with some pretty dizzying heights and brutal and unexpected lows. And for this video, I'll also be doing something different, and hopefully be talking both in real time as well as in post-recording, or well, more specifically, pre-recording. The day that I chose to do this video has been cursed with workmen coming in to do things with the house next door, resulting in a lot of woodwork noises that would absolutely play mayhem with a full live recording. And besides, I can use these pre-recorded lines in order to overlay them over footage of me actually playing the consoles that I'm talking about, because as I very quickly learned the last time that I did this, I'm just not really well equipped to talking from a script and playing games simultaneously. It's just too much for me. Now before I move on and talk about these latest additions, I feel it's fair to talk about some things that were covered in the previous video. In particular, the incident regarding the desktop losing its USB ports while I was in the process of attempting to unbrick my RG Cube. Well, seemingly only a month later, the ports died again, but this time there was absolutely nothing happening at the time, which pretty much all but confirmed that there was no problems at all regarding drivers potentially crashing into each other and breaking everything in the process. And after a few days of poking around, I discovered what was causing it. This USB cable. I can't explain why, but the moment that I plug this thing into any of the USB-A ports on the desktop, something immediately fails, and I can only clear the problem by unplugging the cable and restarting the computer. So whatever this thing is doing to mess up the rig, I just have to remember to never use that cable ever again. But at the very least keep it around so I can use it to explain to others as to what the heck is actually going on with it. For all I know, the power supply on the desktop could still already be on its way out, but in the same breath it could be the motherboard, or it could be anything else really. And guessing incorrectly which of those is the actual culprit is a very expensive mistake to make, especially after what happened with my desktop in the period of 2018-2019, where I ended up changing pretty much every component on it other than the power supply, which was the actual thing that was causing a whole ton of hard drive problems over that time frame. I have also noticed that in my attempts to flash the RG Cube a second time with Android, and I did remember to actually use the laptop this time, I did use this cable, and not only did it not connect to the device at all, I noticed when I was unplugging it that the USB-C end of the connection was really hot. So there is very much the possibility that that cable itself just had a complete hardware failure and could very well have an even more catastrophic failure if I continue to use it. And the thing that worries me the most about that is that I have several other versions of that same cable and manufacturer in various places around my household, from inside my car to by my bed. And so the fact that this has happened has put me in a very concerned mindset regarding it. Speaking of the RG Cube, for some inexplicable reason, I ended up picking up a second one. I don't really have a good answer as to why I got it at all, and especially in this particular colour scheme. It seems like of all the 4 colours that the RG Cube was released in, I ended up with both of the least desirable ones. And to be honest, I kind of like the radiant purple one more than this off-white one, which is a shame because this thing doesn't suffer from as much light bleed as the radiant purple cube. And that, I guess, is something that I also forgot to mention in the first video, which is the whole thing about the RG Cube and its light bleed, which is essentially a phenomenon around the edges of the screen where if you have the brightness high enough, you can see the edges getting a bit brighter than they really should be. It's a situation which you can probably remedy yourself with just a couple of screwdrivers, but I've never really had the time or the patience to spare to really give it an honest effort. It isn't even really all that noticeable unless you're pushing the brightness in circumstances where it's not really a good idea at all to be doing it in the first place, like playing at night for example, because you'll just blast your eyes out. But it is still far from ideal, and the lesson from that have hopefully been well and truly learned by now. But one neat thing that having two RG cubes has done has granted me an opportunity to experiment with one of them and still have one still working properly fine if anything ends up going wrong with the other. And so as a result, this cube is now running a custom build of Android, specifically known as GammaOS Next, which I ended up having to wait a whole 2 months to be able to even try it, as a result of the thing being time-gated behind a bloody Patreon paywall. I really don't want to go into detail as to why I despise the entire concept of that, especially after the last video where I very properly demonstrated how appallingly GammaOS Core ran on the Anbernic RG ARC. I haven't yet properly dived myself into this new operating system, but the number of differences compared to the stock operating system on the other cube is not really that significant, all things considered. One thing that is concerning me straight away is that the bootloader is still considered to be completely unlocked, as the instructions for installing GammaOS Next never mention doing that at all. So not only does this make me very confused as to if you can even relock it without breaking GammaOS Next, it also makes the operating system take over 10 seconds longer than stock to go from powering it on to the lock screen. And for an operating system that's been self-described as being optimized, that is a pretty damn ridiculous thing to have. I've also turned off the RGB lights that are around the sticks, as there is currently no real way to customize their behavior, and I do not like the default behavior. And you can't even change the brightness of that default behavior either. And if you try, then the operating system will just momentarily crash. At the very least, it does recover quickly from that. And another thing is that the RG button in the corner cannot be used to summon a launcher of your choice out of the gate. It does nothing within the operating system by default, and instead, the OS uses Digesho as its dedicated home program. I imagine you can still swap it out as something else if you want, but I would much rather stick with Digesho than anything else for a home app. If you can actually stomach using Emulation Station Desktop Edition, then that front end is far more suited to having a dedicated button for bringing that up instead. And while you can use some strange combination of apps to force this button on the stock operating system to do that, I have not yet seen if that's possible on GammaOS Next. And much to my frustration, although you are actually able to reconfigure that button on Anbernic's 2025 Android devices like the RG Slide, the RG557 and the RG477M, the updates they've released for the 2024 machines have not granted them that same luxury, which is extremely frustrating. Now onto a few good things. It does actually fix the strange cardinal snapping behaviour of the analog sticks, and to a degree that you absolutely cannot just misinterpret as being a placebo effect. About the only thing I can feel is that the mechanical parts within the stick themselves feel like they are giving some physical resistance in those cardinal directions, but you're really not going to be able to feel that unless you're pushing them very, very gingerly. And to be honest, it's nice that we actually finally have an operating system that actually frickin' does that, because I've used a number of other custom firmwares on other devices over the past year that claimed to have a cardinal fix, and yet I never felt any difference in them at all. Apparently, the latest version of Newly now has that fix for 4 of the 6 Anbernic XX series devices. But considering that I was under the impression that they should have been there in the first place, that's kind of an absolutely ridiculous amount of time to wait for something like that. Not to mention that the 34XX and the 35XX Pro have still not been accounted for, even though they are supported by the latest version of Newly. Considering that they all use the same chipset and all of them but the 34XX use the exact same sticks, you'd think it wouldn't be a problem at all. But onto another positive before that negative drags on too long. Although you cannot use the RG button to summon a front end, you can actually use it in RetroArch this time, which is really quite a nice thing to be having. For those of you who are more comfortable with the whole day and press B hotkey system that you see on most of the Linux operating systems, this lets you do exactly that, but without any fear of your /home button accidentally kicking you out of RetroArch altogether or doing something else. Outside of those current benefits though, I have yet to notice much else in my short time with it so far. I'm very sure that GammaOS Next is a more than capable operating system, and it's a damn sight more effective than GammaOS Core ever was on the Anbernic RG. I'm just left baffled by the whole bootloader situation, making it just so incredibly slow to boot up. Talking about my other devices, my RG556 has ultimately been retired, replaced by something else that I'll be talking about a bit later in this video. I did like the RG556 a lot, but the completely alien feeling of that shell was just too much for me. And while I did contemplate getting the RG557 after loving just how nicely the 556 felt in my hands, outside of the feeling of the plastic of course, that ultimately would not end up happening as a result of what I end up buying to replace it instead. If there's any place out there that somehow makes replacement shells for the RG556, I would absolutely be curious about potentially exploring a shell swap, just to have anything that feels better than a pair of hot glass handlebars. And as for things outside of the devices explicitly, the situation I find myself in as a collector of these handhelds has only become more and more awkward as time has passed. This utterly unspeakable governance that I find myself living under has now very much gone ahead with changes to how much of us are allowed to manage our money. And not only does my mother claim that she is not allowed to hold on to more than £6,000 at any given time, though I believe she has been under that rule for much longer than I think she has been, I personally am apparently going to be struck under that exact same rule within the coming months. And as someone who has been desperately trying to hold on to whatever I can, in some slim hope of being able to actually find somewhere else to live in the future, this comes as an absolute complete slap in the face. Not only am I not allowed to hold as much money as I think I need in order to actually be able to go anywhere, I'm effectively forced into a position where I have to throw money around with utter reckless abandon just to even get remotely close to being under that £6,000 mark. Truly what people would call a use it or lose it situation. It just sounds like a completely and utterly irresponsible way of managing money, and just thinking about it makes me incredibly frustrated. As a result of this, the encouragement to stick with this hobby has only grown more and more formidable, as I'm now left wondering what the heck I should even do with a few £1,000s, but ideally in a way that is actually logical and will help me and the family out later down the line, as opposed to just adding more and more hardware to the collection, and stressing out my supply of spare SD cards even more than it already has been. Such is the absurdity of the situation, that mother is even trying to encourage me to do things that I would otherwise never even contemplate, such as going to visit friends in high places. Quite literally, I've barely had the confidence to be able to go driving just over an hour away from home, and there's no way in hell I'm visiting Manchester, unless the two friends that I believe still live over there try and coerce me to coming down for a visit. But now Mum is unironically suggesting that I go and visit my Scottish friend, who is currently living, and I dare quote, in the middle of bloody nowhere. From a single-hour trip within the northwest of England, to a journey that's going to take pretty much more than half the entire day. To say something like that is just a small stretch isn't doing it justice, and I'm convinced that something would absolutely go catastrophically wrong if I were to ever attempt that, and I'd be left stranded over 100 miles away from home. Or worse. But in any case, all this just means is that I apparently have more disposable money than I know what to do with, but not anywhere near enough to actually get my life off the smacking ground. So in the meantime, I'll continue as I have been doing for the past year and a half, keeping my eyes on the second-hand market and picking up anything that catches my curiosity. And I'll probably keep doing this until I have some better idea of exactly what is going on and what I need to do in order to stay out of trouble. And so, without any more delays, and for the sake of my throat, I'll start talking about every device that I've acquired since my last video back in May, which isn't even a quarter of a year ago apparently. And bear this in mind as I go through these 6 devices. Every single device I'll be talking about is a second-hand purchase. Nothing here was bought brand new. So let's get this show on the road, and we're just going to come right out swinging with this first one. The AYN Odin 2 Max, released in 2023. I told you we were coming out swinging. Now at the very least, this thing is actually more than old enough to where it makes sense that I could grab one of these from CEX. But even so, the Odin 2 range is considered to be in the top percentile when it comes to performance of these Android gaming handhelds. Even the power of the newer chipsets we've seen up in 2025 is only barely above parity with the AYN 2 chipset that's in the Odin 2s. What's more, and I wasn't bluffing when I said it, this is the max model of the original Odin 2, with the absolute top spec RAM and internal storage numbers. Given that this is the original model, I think I should also mention the other two variants of the Odin 2 that are out there. You have the Odin 2 Mini, which is extremely close to the PlayStation Vita in both style and form factor, and the Odin 2 Portal, which is an absolutely massive machine in comparison, whose only real claim to fame is the screen. The form factor really is the most important part when it comes to deciding which of the Odin 2s is best for you, and at least to me, I feel like the original is the best. The sticks on the Odin 2 Mini makes its pocketability a bit questionable for me, as well as the fact that it does reportedly get a bit toasty compared to the others, and the screen does infamously suffer from some poor lighting around the edges. The Odin 2 Portal, on the other hand, is not only completely unpocketable, I would not even consider it to be portable. The thing is almost as big as the Steam Deck, but unlike the Steam Deck, it's cursed with an unusually flat and unergonomic design around the back that makes getting an actual comfortable hold of it way more of a challenge than it has any right to be. And while you can get an official grip to make this much less of an issue, not only does it make an already expensive device even more costly and huge and heavy, I'm also pretty sure that making the grip on it makes it so big that it doesn't even fit in any case on the market. So in the end, you end up needing a case for not only the Odin 2 Portal, but also the grip itself. Meanwhile, I just have this thing for my original Odin 2, which makes it a more than portable device. All it's lacking is a dedicated space for a USB-C cable, but this thing's battery life is so goddamn ridiculous that I don't even consider that to be a problem. And in the event that it somehow is, I imagine it wouldn't be that hard to just add a pocket for the cable in the back of the case. Talking about the Odin 2 itself, in effect, this is a true endgame device that is capable of doing pretty much anything that modern day Android is capable of, apart from being used as a phone. And even in just my first few months of owning it, I've only barely scratched the surface of its potential. Not only is this thing capable of running systems all the way up to Nintendo Switch 1, it's recently been granted the ability to boot into Linux-based operating systems such as Rocknix, which is absolutely insane and turns it into the single most powerful portmaster machine that we've seen so far. And yet here's mine, which hasn't been tasked with doing anything like that at all. In fact, it's only been tasked with everything that my Anbernic RG 556 was doing a few months prior, only doing it with a much better feeling plastic shell and also way better performance across the board. But what I find curious is that despite how powerful it is, I've still managed to find performance problems in the games that I would like to play the most on it. My first example is here with Gran Turismo 4, specifically the Spec 2 hack. Now for the most part this game runs really well with plenty of overhead, but whenever I go to specific circuits like Grand Valley or the Nürburgring Nordschleife, the game inexplicably starts to slow down, and it slows down a lot. I'm aware that you can potentially just amp up the performance profile in order to get more out of it, but to me at least it makes absolutely no sense at all as to why this game's performance is so freaking inconsistent, and I haven't been able to find any solutions online for it either. And in the second case, we have the Super Mario Sunshine hack known as Super Mario Sunburn. Now this thing has an in-game options menu, and it grants you the ability to run the game at a full 60 frames per second, which is kind of nuts. But unfortunately, after progressing through the intro sequences of events with absolutely no problems whatsoever, when you load into Delfino Plaza, the game's speed absolutely falls off a goddamn cliff. At the very least, going back to 30 frames per second makes the game runs absolutely fine, and a damn sight better than it did on the Anbernic RG Cube and the RG 556. But it's still another anomaly in my journey of trying to emulate these more modern games. There are naturally still a few other unfortunate oddities here and there with this device as well. I found that the placement of the speakers is not exactly ideal, and that my big hands will end up getting in the way of the speaker holes more often than not, which does make the audio sound a bit strange sometimes. Part of me is honestly wondering if that's the reason why we get so many devices with down-firing speakers, as in that case it's almost impossible for those to have their sounds muffled by someone's hands. I've also found that I'm not exactly a fan of the texture of these analog stick caps, as they kind of feel too sticky for my tastes. And I know that you can quote unquote easily replace them with new ones, but where I live in England, it's kind of impossible to get any of the actually good ones from Etsy because they just do not ship to here at all. And when I looked around on places like Amazon, I not only found almost nothing, but what little I did find looked so comically low quality that it wasn't even worth bothering opening up the pages to look at them in detail. And then there's one other little concern. Mine seems to be making a little creaking noise whenever I put some kind of force on the left side of the shell. It's not much, but it is just barely enough that it makes me want to treat it with kid gloves. But ultimately though, I'm absolutely elated to have bought the Odin 2, which is a good thing, because as far as I'm aware, the original Odin 2 is no longer in production, and as someone who believes it to be the best form of a device that there ever was, that is an absolute tragedy. The Miyoo Mini Plus, released in 2023. What we have here is what most of the YouTube handheld scene would consider to be one of the most important and well-respected machines in the hobby's history. Now I don't know whether it's because this one wasn't bought brand new, but I can only barely agree with the important part, because to me, the Miyoo Mini Plus is not a device that commands some respect from me. In fact, I don't like it at all. This is the first device I've owned since the Anbernic RG 350p, where the speakers would pop every single time you boot up a device or change games, and loudly enough to drive someone to absolute insanity. In my hands, holding it like this, it feels way too small, and trying to get a comfortable hold of it is just absolutely impossible. Its performance is also completely nowhere, with there being basically zero headroom for being able to play around with shaders or anything else to make games look prettier. And bear in mind that this is running the Onion operating system, aka the one thing that saved this device from being a complete failure in the first place, and it also wouldn't be the last time that a Miyoo device has been saved by someone else fixing what they started. But the one thing that absolutely gets me about the Miyoo Mini Plus is its build quality. I've heard from many others talking about it, about how fragile it is, and feeling it in my hands, this shell does not really feel very sturdy. And if there's one thing you want in a truly pocketable device, it's a rugged and durable shell that can take accidentally being pressed against for a split second without instantly crumpling into a puddle of broken plastic. So it's not really strong enough to be pocketable. But what about the case that it comes with? Well, luckily, mine actually came with the original case when I bought it second hand. And as you can see, it makes the Miyoo Mini Plus at least 3 times bigger than normal, which is absolutely ridiculous and makes the device not pocketable, but for a completely different reason altogether. It instead goes from pocketable to just portable. But you know what else is portable? The Odin 2 that I was just talking about a few minutes ago, as well as pretty much any other handheld device with a case. I pretty much only bought this thing to add to the collection and nothing more, and I can't really recommend it to anyone either, especially if your hands are anywhere near as big as mine. At this point, you'd be better off just getting literally any other Anbernic XX series device. The Gamepad Digital Win Mini 8840U, released in 2024. If you remember back at the very beginning of my previous video, then I mentioned that the original Gamepad Digital Win 1 as being the very first device that I owned after the Open Pandora. Fast forward several years, and we now have the Win Mini series of devices, which are essentially the true spiritual successors to the GPD Win 1. This thing remains true to its roots as a micro laptop with a full set of integrated controls, both gamepad and keyboard and touchpad. And touchscreen for that matter, and much to my eternal relief, this thing does not power on at all by opening the lid, which means that I no longer have to worry about it casually cooking itself in my pocket without me knowing about it. And with the benefit of having had some experience tinkering with things like the Steam Deck and the RG Ally X over the years, I've been able to optimise this thing for exactly what I want out of it. Specifically, I've configured it to dedicated software to give me on-demand control over its power profiles, and by default, I have it running about as lightly as it physically can without the chipset tripping over itself. This helps it to run both quietly and as cool as possible, as this thing does unfortunately feel quite awkward if you allow it to get warm. But even at the lowest power level, it's capable of emulating PlayStation 1 and Commodore Amiga absolutely fine, and with shaders to boot. But on top of that, not only can it actually play FTL faster than light, with only minor slowdowns when the screen gets busy, it can actually run long enough on a full battery charge in order to play 2 full runs of it, which makes me incredibly happy as someone who's still modding this game to this very day after over a decade. Really, the only things that bother me about the Win Mini are the price, the charging situation, and the shoulder buttons. The cost of this thing was higher than my Steam Deck OLED by about £100 or so, and the Steam Deck I'm pretty sure does outperform this in terms of the raw numbers. The charging situation is funny in a very strange way, because unlike a lot of cheaper Linux handhelds, which won't charge at all if you plug them into a too overpowered power brick, this thing doesn't charge unless you plug it into an incredibly powerful brick. If you try and plug it into something even slightly below the specs, it just won't do anything, and it's ridiculous like that. I've ended up having to go out today to pick up a 100-watt charging brick specifically just for the Win Mini. And as for the shoulder buttons, I'm not sure if this is how they're supposed to feel when they're brand new, but these do not feel stable at all. Like, they feel that they could quite easily break off when carrying it around in my pocket. And it also doesn't help that the left bumper doesn't feel as nice as the right one. And as one final note, trying to keep this thing up to date is a huge pain in the arse, as there is one specific Windows update that just will not install no matter what. It is unfortunate, but ultimately I am still more than happy that I did manage to get my hands on the GPD Win Mini, after well over a year of deliberation back when it was still brand new. The Anbernic RG 353PS, released in 2023. I knew going straight in when picking up this thing that it likely wasn't going to be seeing serious use, but considering its peculiar form factor, I would just be happy to have it round as part of my ever-growing collection. The RG353PS is to the Super Nintendo controller what the RG Arc is to the Sega Mega Drive. In fact, these two devices have the same exact RK3566 chipset in both of them, which means that in theory their performance profiles should be exactly comparable. And what's more, unlike the RG Arc, the 353PS actually has a few more custom firmwares that it can make use of, and those firmwares actually recognise the presence of the function button. For the most part, my journey with the 353PS took me through 3 completely separate firmwares, starting with ArcOS. Despite the fact that there was no explicitly mentioned support for this exact model, it was mentioned somewhere that the firmware for the RG353M would work just fine. And it did work, up until the point when I recognised that the volume buttons were not actually capable of being used for controlling volume, even if they could inexplicably still be used for controlling the screen's brightness. And then, as a result of being wary of Rocknix after my time using it with the Arc S, I looked at a fork of Rocknix instead, known as Unofficial OS, and I did that under the assumption that because the 353PS was explicitly mentioned in the downloads page and had its own dedicated download, as opposed to a blanket download for the entire RK3566 chipset, that maybe the function button would actually be useful this time. And to my delight, it was. But what was not to my delight was my time trying to wrangle with the hotkey situation, and, spoiler alert, I'm still not done with that. Unofficial OS was seemingly hell-bent on making it so that I couldn't just use a single tap of the function button in order to bring up RetroArch, and it would constantly be resetting the button combinations so that it was impossible to delete all of them entirely. Once I learned that disabling the auto-config setting for controllers in RetroArch would enable me to actually go about changing that, things took a drastic turn for the worse, as the device then decided to pull on me exactly what happened in my last video with the R35S, where pressing the function button to open up RetroArch, or just opening up RetroArch in general, completely froze out basically all the controls and rendered it completely useless. Nothing that I tried was able to get around this problem, not even connecting a second controller directly to it via a USB cable. As a result of this, I ended up shelving the device for over a month, letting it rest as just another relatively neat looking gaming thing that would ultimately not actually be used for gaming. And then in preparation for this video, I dragged it out of mothballs and decided to put Rocknix on it after all, just out of morbid curiosity. So imagine my reaction when I learned that the function button actually does work in this operating system. Despite this though, my struggles with the controls locking out are far from over, and even this mature operating system insists on making my life a living heck trying to find out a solution to it. I've been able to put it into a position where every command is working as I want it to when directly loading into RetroArch, but the instant that I try and load any game through any of the menus in Rocknix, it loads something else completely arbitrarily and completely outside of my control, and then everything just breaks, forcing me to start all over again. That right there is a prime example of why a good custom firmware should never be allowed to manipulate the emulators remotely. It's like what some other companies do with their countless options menus upon options menus, with many of them all vying for control over the same exact things, and then ultimately nothing ends up getting done. Except in my case, the end result is a catastrophic failure. In the end, I've conceded defeat on the matter and have just simply elected to leave it in a position where the function button is being used as, well, the function button, instead of the Rocknix default of the select button being used instead. Even if it's not ultimately quite what I hoped for, at the very least I do have a very fun shaped handheld to mess around with. And it really just does beg the question of what exactly is going on behind the scenes when I'm trying to simplify the hotkeys like this. The Analogue Pocket, released in 2022. Dear God. Welcome to probably the biggest mistake of my entire collection, arguably even bigger than the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. This other device, also known as a Pocket, and it really is kind of a way too common name at this point, is the poster child for a form of emulation technology known as Field Programmable Gate Array, or FPGA for short. Basically, unlike conventional emulation which works on the software level, FPGA attempts to emulate the hardware setup of the console itself. When it works as intended, this method of emulation can result in an experience with significantly greater accuracy to the original hardware than pretty much anything else that exists at the moment. And you also get better controls in the form of extremely low levels of input lag. But on the flip side, you lose access to a lot of the customizability that software emulation provides, such as the ability to upscale, access to shaders, and even sometimes just basic things like save states or even just a functioning real-time clock function. Which brings us to the Analogue Pocket here, and considering the slot in the back, it's clearly designed around being used to play the original Game Boy series cartridges, which I unfortunately am not able to demonstrate all that well here, as a result of every single Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color and, well, regular Game Boy game that I've ever owned seemingly going completely missing somewhere in this sodding house. All I was able to find was this copy of The Sum of All Fears, which does luckily still work after taking a moment to scrub the pins clean with a cotton bud. But mercifully, this thing is not just restricted to playing original cartridges, otherwise I would have never bought it in the first place. Through its open FPGA functionality, it is capable of running hardware cores developed by others to play a certain variety of other systems. And I say a certain variety specifically, because considering the fact that this thing is around the same price as the Retroid Pocket 5 and its compatriots, its inability to play PlayStation 1 is absolutely goddamn ridiculous. Not that you'd be able to play properly most of the games for it anyways, as not only does this thing not have L2 and R2 buttons, the shoulder buttons that it does have are some of the worst that I have ever used. Not only do the shoulder buttons have way too much play in them to the point where it makes me feel that they could very easily break off at any moment. If you're playing original cartridges, then they are so close to the cartridge itself that it's too easy to just accidentally dislodge the cart with your finger and now your game has completely crashed. This cartridge slot in general is just a complete and absolute goddamn atrocity. It makes absolutely no conscious effort to even attempt to hold anything in place securely. And to make matters even worse, it doesn't even come with a blanking plate so that you can keep the slot clean when you're not even using it. When you combine this with the fact that this thing inexplicably manages to have sharp edges in the middle of the sides of the device, this expensive and boutique handheld is somehow one of the least comfortable things that I've tried playing games on in a very long time. The one saving grace that it has is that it has the ability to emulate Commodore Amiga absolutely perfectly. And through the Amiga Vision collection, you are capable of playing through a pretty comprehensive collection of classic games. But even so, the time it takes to boot up into Amiga Vision is about half a minute, so having to go through that every time without access to save states can be quite a chore, despite the fact that the Analogue Pocket does actually have a pretty fast boot up time. You're also not able to bind the buttons for the Amiga in a way that makes it possible to play games like Lemmings on it. Not unless you feel like playing the entire game without the pause button. Not to mention that the D-pad's mouse control is much worse than using an analog stick in RetroArch. It also makes it pretty sketchy when it comes to playing any games that require both joypad and keyboard controls at the same time, and though it does have access to a virtual keyboard function, it's still not an ideal solution. And speaking of the controls, this D-pad is arguably even worse than the shoulder buttons. It's way too loud, to the point where it's almost making my Sega Saturn controller from the last video blush. But even worse than that, the diagonals on it are so brokenly sensitive that I can't even attempt to play any gay Pokemon games on it without any of my attempts to walk just to the right, instead just going up or down for absolutely no reason whatsoever. And even if that wasn't a problem, the Analogue Pocket's lack of a real-time clock means that any Pokemon game with a day and night cycle being played via the SD card will not load the correct time at all. It'll just freeze at whatever time you last saved the game at. And at this point, I think I've said more than enough. The Analogue Pocket is an absolutely overpriced disaster class, and I can only hope that when I finally get my hands on the Mr. Pi, that it can single-handedly redeem the whole concept of FPGA gaming to me, and undo all the damage that this thing has done to its cause. But considering the fact that they said it was going to be shipping in early August at the absolute worst, the fact that it took until the 20th of August before I got any notification that it was actually in the courier's hands is a bit unfortunate. What's more, I had to fumble my way through the order process to hopefully pick out only the parts that I actually need in order to make the Mr. Pi work. The only option they were selling as a bundle came with several other things that I absolutely have zero interest in using, and so I'm just hoping and praying that what I did select is enough to actually make it work. God, I hate it when companies pull crap like that. And finally, the Anbernic RG 34XXSP, released in 2025. After two utterly calamitous purchases, we end off on one heck of a high note. I'm still beyond surprised that I was able to get this thing second hand, and even more amazingly, only less than 2 months after it came out in the first place. I can only wonder the reasons as to why it ended up in CEX as soon as it did, but at the time of purchase, there were no publicly declared custom firmwares that supported the 34XXSP, nor the 35XX Pro, although as mentioned earlier, newly Gladiator 2 has since come out and granted them both initial support. But back then, I was left running around for over an hour trying to figure out what I would even attempt to get running on with this thing, especially considering the fact that I went through multiple different options with the 353PS as a result of ArcOS having broken volume controls on it. But by some miracle, about a week beforehand, a video appeared from a channel known as Retro Tech Dad, which not only spoke about the 34XXSP somehow emulating Nintendo GameCube, or at least trying to. He linked to downloads for an experimental version of MyooOS Pixie, made specifically for testing that. But thankfully, as it turns out, that build remains mostly capable of doing everything else that MyooOS currently had in its skill set anyway. So now we have this fella, the second device running MyooOS that I still own alongside the 40XXV, And if you remember my last video, then you'll know that I did have some nitpicks about MyooOS back then. And at least as far as the box art scraping situation is concerned, that has not only not changed at all, but I'm not convinced that the next version is going to be doing anything to help matters with that either. But at the very least, this thing somehow managed to avoid the issue last time, with the RetroArch front end crashing completely if you attempted to change it from that awful pixelated one, at least for the time being. Now looking around this fella, you can say it's pretty damn close to the Miyoo flip that I mentioned briefly in the last video. Except unlike that piece of crap, not only does this thing have proper custom firmware options, its hinges had no reported problems at all. Now I do say that knowing that as of the past month or so, the Retroid Pocket 2 Flip's hinge has had reports of hairline cracks just like what happened with the original Retroid Pocket Flip 1. But at the same time, I don't think that the RG35XXSP's hinge has ever had any problems, and I believe that thing has been over for well over a year at this point. My only real complaint about the exterior elements of the 34XXSP is that it once again has really loud and hollow sounding shoulder buttons, although luckily they aren't anywhere near as noisy as the ones on the RG40XXV. And I haven't even mentioned the screen yet, and that's probably because of the fact that I managed to pick this up in the GameCube colour scheme. Maybe if it was the bright yellow model it would have stuck out a bit more, but at least on this darker one here, that big bezel up on top has not been any issue for me at all. And also what hasn't bothered me at all is about how well this screen handles 4x3 content. I know it's a smaller picture, but let's face it, you don't buy a device that's this incredibly compact and pocketable if you also want a big screen. If you're going to do that, then you'd be much better off buying the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, or even the Anbernic RG Slide, which I have been gravely tempted to pick up for some time now. It helps that the screen resolution is only strictly on par or larger than with the other XX series devices, minus the RG Cube XX, meaning that picture quality across the board is not suffering even slightly. And in exchange, not only did it get completely crisp Game Boy Advance gameplay, and also Bandai Wonderswan is also extremely close to this 3x2 aspect ratio, you get a fantastic screen for playing Commodore Amiga and Commodore 64 games. What I've learned since that last video is that the emulators for the Amiga and the Commodore 64 have an auto-crop functionality that can dynamically cut out unused areas of the rendering window to give you the biggest image possible of the actual gameplay. And when you do that, you very quickly realise that a lot of the games on those systems are technically playing in a wider aspect ratio than 4x3. And so as a result, they end up looking absolutely incredible on wider aspect ratios like this, as well as other Android-based devices like the RG556 and the Retroid Pocket 5. Now this does come with some caveats though. Specifically for Commodore Amiga, you are not able to run the PUAE 2021 emulator in the cycle exact configuration on these lower spec devices, because if you do, the performance is going to absolutely fall off a cliff. You need at least a Retroid Pocket Classic in order to pull that, but ideally you want something at least as powerful as the Retroid Pocket 5. And when you select the non-exact cycle method, you get warned that you will end up seeing strange graphical glitches from time to time. Like here with the intro sequence to Turrican 3, when the antagonist shows up during the intro cutscene, his face is just completely not rendered at all. In addition, you do need to set up the core controls to specifically assign your right analog stick to the mouse cursor for games like Lemmings or Cannon Fodder. Otherwise, by default, in the core, it will assign both analog sticks to the mouse instead. And considering the fact that these old games were often played with joysticks, having the left analog stick set to act as a joystick does give a more authentic experience overall. You do also need to go into the audio settings menu and lower the stereo split to something way closer to being centered, or absolutely dead center in the case of devices like this which only have mono audio. If you forget to do this and you play with headphones on, you are absolutely going to feel that channel separation, and it's not only incredibly jarring, at least to me, it's also very uncomfortable to listen to for extended periods of time. And as one more thing, for perhaps the best experience emulating Commodore Amiga in RetroArch, I would suggest to look for what is known as the Amiga Game Selector version 2.7, also known as AGS, which is basically an Amiga hard drive image that has been configured to act as a front-ending container for practically every Commodore Amiga game and music demo that has ever existed, all pre-configured to run as seamlessly as possible with a controller. You can also assign favoured games within AGS, and it'll actually save them within that file itself, meaning that those favourites will persist across every single device that you copy that file onto. It is absolutely a massive download size though, with even the smallest incarnation of AGS coming in at 16.5GB just for the compressed download, and other downloads going as high as 60GB. With my uncompressed version of the RetroArch AGS file coming in at just shy of 30GB, I would advise using the spare space in your firmware's SD card in order to hold AGS, while your second SD card holds everything else. However, this does assume that your primary firmware card is at least 64GB, although luckily the one that came with my 34XXSP did have that. And just to make sure that you do download the RetroArch version of it, as there are other downloads tailored to other environments such as the Raspberry Pi, the A500 Mini, and even original hardware. And the funny thing is that I'm speaking about the Commodore Amiga, but I'm speaking about it in the context of a device that looks like a Game Boy Advance SP, which is a testament to just how goddamn versatile this machine really is, and what it's able to play well. This even translates over to Portmaster, where even though I have noticed that some games won't start up when they ought to, it does work pretty damn well. For the OpenTyrian ports, for example, the aspect ratio once again comes in excellently, and even if it isn't fully integer scaled, it fills up the screen almost perfectly and it looks absolutely goddamn amazing. And what also helps a lot on the Portmaster front is that not only does this thing have an unusually above average RAM count of 2GB, especially in comparison to the other XX series devices, the fact is that it still has both analog sticks, just like with the Miyoo Flip. And even if they don't serve much purposes to most of the games that you'd ideally want to play on the 34XXSP, these will come in absolutely clutch for many of these PC ports. And because it's a clamshell, it's a device that I don't mind has the analog sticks at all, because the form factor keeps them very well protected, thus getting around my reasoning for things like the RG35XXH not really being considered pocketable to me, because the most fragile parts of a device are being completely exposed to getting smacked around inside the confines of your tight pockets. And if those end up breaking, there's every chance that you simply can't even control the device depending on how mangled the stick outputs end up getting. But ultimately at the end of this, I am more than delighted with this pickup, and it's likely going to be my preferred carry handheld for the foreseeable future, especially as my old jacket's age has finally taken it out of service, and the jacket that I have now doesn't quite have the generous pockets that my old one was blessed with. And that is every device that I have managed to pick up since the last video. And as another reminder, every single one of those purchases was second hand. So now at the end of all this, what else is there to talk about before I call this a wrap? I guess for me specifically, the hunt for a proper successor to the Anbernic RG ARC, or a proper firmware for the ARC itself, will end up continuing for the foreseeable future. MUOS has seemingly not made any intention whatsoever to change the entries for planned support list in the past few months, so the hope there continues to fade towards what could easily be considered levels of copium at this point. And as for planned releases and announcements, we somehow have exactly one mention, and it comes from an absolutely bizarre source, the Magic X Retro 45. They've never really been good with names, have they? All we have now are 3 pre-production renders, which show some vague shapes of what parts of it are going to end up looking like. But what we do see is that we have a device that has a Nintendo 64 inspired analog stick, and a 6-button layout that is marked with both Nintendo 64 and Sega button notation. Unless someone throws their hat into the ring before it comes out, I'm almost certainly going to try and pick this fella up. And that's despite the fact that I have many concerns about it already. Its visual design appears to be more closely following that of the other Magic X handheld devices, which means that unlike the RG ARC, it's not going to be shaped like a Sega controller. This immediately takes away one of my absolute favourite aspects of the RG Arc, in that it was an absolutely incredibly comfortable device to hold in my hands. The other reservation that I currently have is likely going to be whatever powertrain it gets equipped with. With its design hinting at wanting to play Nintendo 64 and ideally also Sega Saturn games, you do want some kick in it, and certainly more than what you get with the XX series devices and pretty much anything else within the sub £100 price bracket that Magic X has been pretty comfortably stuck within. But as of right now, I believe the most powerful chipset Magic X has ever deployed so far is the all-winner A133 Plus, aka the thing that was in the TrimUI Smart Pro from the last video, as well as the TrimUI Brick. That chipset has already demonstrated that it is not only not as competent as the all-winner H700, which is already nowhere near powerful enough to be considered capable of playing Sega Saturn, but it also gets hot to the point of it making the TrimUI devices pretty uncomfortable to hold for extended periods of time, especially the TrimUI Brick with its metal backplate. Unless they completely surprise us and do something like being the first company after Retroid to make use of the chipset that's in the Retroid Pocket Classic, we could very easily end up with something completely underpowered for its mission profile. Except unlike the RG Arc, it will at least have a good starting operating system. Now the only question that remains is if we will get to see its physical form before the end of the year. And considering how long it took them to release the Magic X 040, I'm not holding out too much hope for that. And then quite literally the night before I filmed this video, we heard teaser information about the AYN Odin 3 and, much more to my curiosity, the AYN 4. Now that Android is seemingly starting to get a handle on multi-screen devices, the gloves have well and truly come off as everyone dives into this new niche head-on. Retroid, which I believe are technically a sub-branch of AYN, went in first with a clip-on second screen primarily for their own handhelds, but others will also be supported to some extent as well. And while AYN have already taken a couple of stabs at the idea, those were both Windows-based devices and the first Android-based one is likely to be the first one to come out. But with this announcement as well as the reputation that they've been gathering ever since the original Odin 2, my interest has been grabbed like nothing else before. We've been slowly getting information over the past 24 hours about it, and what we have so far appears to be a bigger screen than the Retroid Pocket Flip 2, on top of the Retroid Pocket Mini's squarish screen not being on the bottom, and two different performance specs spread between two very mature and well-respected chipsets, in the Snapdragon 865 seen in the Retroid Pocket 5, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that was in the Odin 2. Assuming the prices are not too severe, and I have not yet seen any information regarding that, I think my plan is to try and go for the 8 Gen 2 version, as that's going to have by far the best shot of being the best Nintendo 3DS machine that we've ever seen. And as for the Odin 2 that I already own, this might be its golden opportunity for me to actually tap into its ability to boot into Rocknix and turn it into the absolute god of Portmaster. For sure, these are some very interesting times to be a handheld enthusiast. That brings us to the end of the video, which, unlike last time, I don't really have a punchline to end on, which makes me feel a bit unfortunate right after the hype that I just spoke of a few seconds ago. I'm still crossing my fingers that maybe before the end of this year, I'll have finally found my perfect retro handheld and or my favourite everyday carry machine. As it stands right now, I'm not quite sure if I have the former, but the RG34X XP is currently my best candidate for the latter. I still cannot believe my luck that I was able to get that thing second hand so soon, and for only 50 quid. I'm not kidding that if you look up the 34X XSP on Amazon UK, every single price puts it deep into triple figures, which is a complete and utter goddamn farce, and speaks volumes about just how bad it is trying to buy from Amazon. So with that, I think I'd best call the video here before my vocal cords decide that they don't want to work for the rest of the week. Maybe I'll get another chance to do a video like this in the future, but that'll be a conundrum for whenever that day comes. So until then, TTFN.